There's a photograph that exists somewhere in the archives of the Second World War. It shows a German officer, his uniform perfectly pressed, his cap tilted at the regulation angle, standing beside a transport truck in the winter of 1944. What the photograph doesn't show is what happened 3 hours after it was taken. What it doesn't capture is the moment this man made a choice that would save over 30 lives, while putting his own family, his career and his neck directly on the chopping block of the Third Reich. His name was Albert Battel, and the story you're about to hear is one that history tried desperately hard to bury. Because this wasn't just any Nazi officer who had a change of heart. This was a man who wore the swastika, who saluted the Führer every morning, and who somehow found a way to weaponize the one thing the SS never saw coming, the image of a drunk, incompetent fool. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single act of staged drunkenness became one of the most brilliant and dangerous deceptions of the entire war. To understand what Albert Battel did, you need to understand where he was standing when he did it. The year was 1942, and the place was Przemyśl, a city that straddled the border between Poland and what was then the Soviet-occupied East. This wasn't Berlin. This wasn't even Warsaw. Przemyśl was a smaller city, but it held strategic importance because of its railway connections and its position as a gateway between two hell zones of the Eastern Front. By the summer of that year, the city had already been transformed into something unrecognizable. The Jewish population, which had once made up nearly half of the city's residents, had been forcibly moved into a cramped ghetto on the north side of town. Barbed wire, armed guards, starvation rations, the standard blueprint of Nazi occupation. Albert Battel was a Wehrmacht lawyer stationed there, a man in his mid-40s who had joined the army not out of ideological fervor, but because it was expected of men his age and profession. He wasn't a true believer. He was a functionary, a legal advisor whose job was to smooth over the administrative headaches of military occupation. But Przemyśl in 1942 wasn't just another occupied city going through the motions of oppression. It was a pressure cooker about to explode. The action, the Nazi term for the systematic liquidation of entire communities, was being planned with cold bureaucratic efficiency. The SS had arrived in the region with lists, with trucks, with a timeline. The Przemyśl ghetto, home to roughly 12,000 Jewish men, women and children, was scheduled for total liquidation. The date had been set, the transportation had been arranged, the killing sites had been prepared, and every single person with a uniform and a conscience in that city knew exactly what was coming. Most of them looked away. Some of them participated. A few of them quietly drank themselves numb in the officers' quarters, trying to ignore the screams that would soon echo through the streets. Albert Battel did none of these things. What separated Battel from the thousands of other Wehrmacht officers scattered across occupied Europe wasn't his rank. It wasn't his connections. It wasn't even his courage, though he would need plenty of that in the days to come. What separated him was something far more dangerous in the machinery of the Third Reich: clarity. He saw exactly what was about to happen, and he understood that the system he served had become a mechanism of industrialized murder. The legal frameworks he had once believed in, the military codes, the chains of command, all of it had been twisted into something monstrous. And somewhere in the quiet hours before the action was set to begin, Albert Battel made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to write a letter of protest. He wasn't going to resign in moral outrage. He was going to do something far more subversive. He was going to pretend to be so drunk, so incompetent, so utterly useless that the SS would have no choice but to stand down and let him make a catastrophic mistake. The plan was insane. The risks were astronomical. If anyone suspected for even a moment that his drunkenness was an act, Battel wouldn't just be demoted or discharged. He would be arrested, tried for treason, and executed. His wife would be interrogated, his family would be marked. The Nazi state didn't forgive sabotage, especially not from within its own ranks. And yet on the morning of the 26th of July, 1942, as the SS prepared to enter the Przemyśl ghetto and begin loading families onto trains bound for the Bełżec extermination camp, Albert Battel walked out of his quarters, reeking of alcohol, stumbling slightly. His words slurred just enough to sound believable. He climbed into a military truck, ordered the driver to take him to the bridge that connected the city to the ghetto, and then did something that would echo through history. He blockaded the bridge, and when the SS officers arrived, furious and demanding to know what the hell he thought he was doing, Battel looked them in the eye with the glazed expression of a man 3 sheets to the wind and told them he had orders to secure the area. Orders that didn't exist. The SS didn't shoot him on the spot. They didn't arrest him immediately, because in that moment, Albert Battel had transformed himself into something the machinery of genocide couldn't quite process, a bureaucratic obstacle wrapped in the plausible deniability of human stupidity. And while the SS scrambled to confirm his non-existent orders, while they radioed their superiors and argued amongst themselves, Albert Battel quietly opened the back of his truck and let over 30 Jewish workers climb inside. Workers who were supposed to be on a list, workers who were supposed to be dead by sundown. He drove them out of the ghetto, past the confused guards, past the checkpoints, and into a military barracks where the SS had no jurisdiction. And then, as the sun set over Przemyśl and the action began in brutal earnest, Albert Battel sobered up, filed a perfectly routine report about securing essential laborers, and waited to see if anyone would figure out what he had just done. The next morning arrived with the kind of silence that follows violence. The streets of Przemyśl were empty, except for the occasional patrol and the dark stains on the cobblestones that no one spoke about. The action had proceeded exactly as the SS had planned, with ruthless efficiency and mechanical precision. Thousands of people had been rounded up, loaded onto cattle cars, and sent east to a place whose name would become synonymous with horror. The ghetto that had housed 12,000 souls now held barely a fraction of that number. The survivors moved through the ruins like ghosts, knowing that their reprieve was temporary, that the next action was simply a matter of time. And in a military barracks on the edge of the city, 33 Jewish workers sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the fact that they were still breathing. They had no idea who the Wehrmacht officer was who had pulled them out of the ghetto. They didn't know his name, they didn't know if he would protect them tomorrow or hand them over to save his own skin. All they knew was that a man in a German uniform had opened a door when every other door had been slammed shut. Albert Battel woke up that morning with the knowledge that he had bought these people hours, maybe days, but certainly not safety. The barracks he had moved them to were under Wehrmacht jurisdiction, which meant the SS couldn't simply march in and take them without going through proper channels. But proper channels in the Third Reich were only as strong as the people willing to enforce them, and Battel knew that his authority was a thin shield against an organization that answered directly to Heinrich Himmler. The SS had been embarrassed. They had been outmaneuvered by a supposedly drunk lawyer who had somehow managed to secure essential workers right under their noses, and embarrassment in the Nazi hierarchy was a dangerous thing. It created grudges. It created investigations. It created the kind of attention that could unravel everything Battel had carefully constructed. He couldn't afford another dramatic rescue. He couldn't afford to look like a saboteur. What he needed now was something even more difficult than the drunken deception. He needed to look like a loyal, competent officer who had simply followed regulations to the letter. So Battel did what any good lawyer would do. He buried his act of defiance under a mountain of paperwork. He filed reports justifying the retention of the workers as essential to Wehrmacht operations. He cited regulations, military codes, and logistical necessities. He made it sound so mundane, so bureaucratically airtight, that challenging it would require someone to admit that the SS didn't actually care about military efficiency, only about killing every Jew they could find. And in the twisted logic of Nazi administration, where appearing proper was sometimes more important than being ideologically pure, this strategy worked. The SS grumbled. They filed complaints. They made it clear that Albert Battel was now on their list of problem officers, but they didn't storm the barracks. They didn't arrest him. Not yet. The workers, meanwhile, began to understand that their survival depended on making themselves indispensable. They worked longer hours than required. They volunteered for the hardest tasks. They became invisible in their usefulness, hoping that if they could just prove their value to the Wehrmacht, they might outlast the war. Some of them were skilled tradesmen. Others were clerks, translators, and laborers. What united them was the fragile understanding that they existed in a bureaucratic loophole, a space between two competing arms of the German war machine. The Wehrmacht wanted their labor, the SS wanted their deaths. And Albert Battel, the man who had created this impossible situation, now had to maintain it without getting himself or them killed. But maintaining a lie in the Third Reich was like trying to hold water in your hands. The longer you held it, the more it slipped through your fingers. By the autumn of 1942, the pressure was mounting. The SS had begun asking questions. Why were these workers still in Wehrmacht custody? Why hadn't they been transferred? What made them so essential that they couldn't be replaced with Polish or Ukrainian labor? And every question was a probe, a test to see if Battel's story would crack. He answered each one with the calm precision of a lawyer who knew that the moment he hesitated, the moment he showed doubt, the entire structure would collapse. He invented new justifications. He forged new documents. He played the role of the meticulous bureaucrat so convincingly that even some of his fellow officers began to believe that he actually cared about military efficiency rather than human lives. And all the while, the clock was ticking toward the moment when the SS would stop asking questions and simply take what they wanted. Winter came to Przemyśl like an executioner's blade, sharp and unforgiving. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the already desperate conditions in what remained of the ghetto became a slow-motion death sentence. Frostbite, starvation, disease. The SS didn't even need to organize another action. They could simply wait for the cold to do their work for them. But the 33 workers in Battel's barracks had heat, had food rations, had walls that kept out the wind. And that disparity did not go unnoticed. Other Jews in the ghetto began to whisper about the Wehrmacht officer who had somehow saved a group of workers. Rumors spread. Fantasies took hold. Maybe he would do it again. Maybe there was a way to get onto his list, to become essential, to survive. But Albert Battel knew that hope was the most dangerous thing he could allow to spread, because hope created desperation, and desperation created attention. And attention was the one thing that would get everyone killed. He began to isolate himself from the workers he had saved. He stopped visiting the barracks personally. He communicated only through written orders, through intermediaries, through the cold, bureaucratic distance that kept him from appearing too invested in their survival. It was a calculated cruelty, a necessary performance. If anyone suspected that he cared about these people as human beings, rather than as assets, the entire deception would collapse. So he played the role of the dispassionate officer, the man who saw Jewish workers the same way he saw ammunition supplies or fuel reserves. Just another line item in the Wehrmacht's logistical machinery. And it worked, but it cost him something that couldn't be measured in reports or regulations. Every day he maintained the lie. Every day he looked the other way as more people died in the ghetto. He felt the weight of his own complicity growing heavier. He had saved 33 people. He had condemned thousands by his inaction. And the question that haunted him in the dark hours before dawn was whether saving a few while serving a machine of death made him a hero, or just a collaborator with a guilty conscience. By early 1943, the situation in Przemyśl had deteriorated beyond recognition. The ghetto had been liquidated entirely. The final action had come in September of the previous year, and the few Jews who remained were either in hiding or in labor camps scattered across the region. The 33 workers in Battel's custody were now among the last Jewish survivors in the entire city. And that made them a target. The SS had moved on to other regions, other ghettos, other killing operations, but they hadn't forgotten about the Wehrmacht lawyer who had interfered with their work. Reports had been filed, complaints had been escalated, and somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Reich Security Main Office, Albert Battel's name had been added to a list of unreliable officers who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the final solution. It wasn't an arrest warrant, not yet, but it was a mark, a stain on his record that would follow him for the rest of his service. Battel knew his time was running out. The longer the war dragged on, the more desperate the Nazi leadership became, and desperation made them less tolerant of bureaucratic obstacles. The regulations he had been hiding behind were being rewritten. The loopholes were being closed. The Wehrmacht's autonomy was being stripped away as the SS consolidated power over all aspects of occupation policy. And the workers in his barracks, the people whose lives depended on his ability to maintain the fiction that they were essential, could feel the walls closing in. Some of them began to prepare for the inevitable. They hid valuables, memorized escape routes, made contact with Polish resistance groups who might be able to smuggle them out of the city. Others simply prayed, hoping that the war would end before the SS came for them. But everyone understood that their survival had always been temporary, a brief reprieve in a machinery designed to kill them. And then, in the spring of 1943, everything changed. Albert Battel received new orders. He was being transferred away from Przemyśl, reassigned to a different post in a different city. The official reason was routine rotation of personnel, but Battel understood what it really meant. The SS had finally maneuvered him out of position. Without him there to maintain the bureaucratic protection, the 33 workers would be absorbed back into the general Jewish labor pool, which was just another way of saying they would be sent to the camps. He had days, maybe a week, to figure out how to protect them after he was gone. And for the first time since the summer of 1942, Albert Battel didn't have a plan. He had paperwork, he had regulations, he had the reputation of a meticulous officer, but none of that would matter once he stepped onto the train and left Przemyśl behind. The days before his transfer became a desperate race against administrative machinery. Battel spent every waking hour in his office, drafting letters, filing appeals, creating new classifications for the workers that would make them untouchable even after his departure. He invented job titles that sounded crucial to the war effort. He backdated documents to make it appear that these workers had been essential for months longer than they actually had been. He forged signatures from officers who had already been transferred or killed on the Eastern Front, knowing that dead men couldn't contradict his paperwork. It was forgery on a scale that would have earned him a firing squad if anyone had bothered to verify the details. But that was the beautiful thing about Nazi bureaucracy. It was so bloated, so overwhelmed with paperwork from 1,000 different fronts, that nobody had time to check everything. As long as the forms looked official, as long as the stamps were in the right places, the system would process them without question. And Battel was counting on that willful blindness to buy these people a few more months of life, but paperwork alone wouldn't save them. Battel needed someone on the ground, someone who would continue to enforce the protections after he was gone. He began cultivating relationships with other Wehrmacht officers in Przemyśl, men who weren't necessarily sympathetic to Jews, but who valued order and regulation above ideological purity. He presented the workers not as human beings deserving of mercy, but as assets that shouldn't be wasted by the SS's chaotic killing sprees. He appealed to their professional pride, their resentment of the SS's interference in military affairs, their desire to maintain Wehrmacht autonomy in a system that was increasingly dominated by Himmler's death squads. And slowly, grudgingly, a few of them agreed to maintain the protection. Not because they cared about saving lives, but because they didn't want the SS telling them what to do. It was a fragile alliance built on ego and institutional rivalry rather than morality. But in the world Albert Battel was navigating, that was the only kind of alliance that had any chance of surviving. On his final day in Przemyśl, Battel did something he had carefully avoided for months. He visited the barracks where the 33 workers lived. He didn't announce himself. He didn't make a speech. He simply walked through the space, observing the people whose lives had become entangled with his own impossible gamble. He saw families who had been torn apart and somehow found each other again. He saw children who had learned to stay silent, to make themselves small, to survive in a world that wanted them dead. He saw men and women who worked themselves to exhaustion every day because they understood that the moment they became useless, they became expendable. And he saw the fear in their eyes when they recognized him, the unspoken question that hung in the air. What happens to us when you leave? Battel couldn't answer that question. He couldn't promise them safety. He couldn't even promise them another week. All he could do was nod, a brief acknowledgement of the shared understanding that they were all trapped in a system neither side could control. Then he left. He boarded the train that would take him west, away from Przemyśl, away from the workers he had saved, away from the evidence of his defiance. The countryside rolled past his window, scarred by war and occupation, dotted with burned villages and mass graves that no one would ever properly document. And Albert Battel sat in his compartment, a Wehrmacht officer in a pressed uniform, and wondered if what he had done mattered at all. 33 people saved out of millions murdered, a single drop of mercy in an ocean of blood. Was that enough to call himself anything other than a collaborator who had occasionally grown a conscience? The question would haunt him for the rest of his life. But in that moment, on that train, all he could think about was whether the protections he had built would hold, or whether he had simply delayed the inevitable by a few months. The workers in Przemyśl waited. They worked. They survived. Some of the protections Battel had created held for weeks. Others collapsed within days. The officers he had cultivated as allies proved unreliable, their commitment to protecting Jewish workers evaporating the moment it became inconvenient or dangerous. By the summer of 1943, most of the 33 had been transferred to labor camps. Some were sent to factories, others to construction projects. A few simply disappeared into the vast machinery of the Holocaust, their fates unknown and undocumented. But a handful, a small handful, managed to survive until the end of the war. And when they did, they remembered the name of the Wehrmacht officer who had staged a drunken blockade on a bridge in July of 1942. They remembered Albert Battel. Albert Battel's transfer didn't save him from the consequences of what he had done. It simply delayed them. His new posting was in Katowice, another occupied city, another administrative assignment far from the front lines. But the whispers followed him. Other officers had heard rumors about the lawyer from Przemyśl who had interfered with an SS action. Some admired him quietly in the privacy of their own thoughts, never daring to say it aloud. Others viewed him with suspicion, wondering if his loyalty to the Reich was as solid as it needed to be. And the SS, the organization he had humiliated, didn't forget. They began building a file on him, collecting reports, documenting every interaction, every decision, every moment where Battel's actions could be interpreted as insufficient enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. It was a slow-burning investigation, the kind that didn't need to rush because the Third Reich had all the time in the world, except it didn't. By late 1943, the tide of the war was turning. Stalingrad had fallen, the Allies had landed in Italy, and the invincible Wehrmacht was beginning to look very vincible indeed. As the military situation deteriorated, the Nazi leadership became increasingly paranoid about internal threats. Officers who had once been tolerated for their competence were now scrutinized for their ideological purity. The definition of treason expanded to include not just active resistance, but passive failure to demonstrate sufficient hatred of the Reich's enemies. And Albert Battel, with his carefully maintained neutrality, with his legalistic approach to orders, with his documented history of protecting Jewish workers, was exactly the kind of officer who attracted the wrong kind of attention. In early 1944, he was quietly removed from active duty. The official reason was health concerns. Battel had developed a heart condition, a legitimate medical issue that gave the Wehrmacht a convenient excuse to sideline him without creating a scandal. But everyone who mattered understood what was really happening. He was being pushed out, neutralized, rendered harmless. And if the war had lasted another year, if the Reich had survived long enough to purge its ranks of unreliable elements, Albert Battel would have almost certainly faced a court-martial. But the war didn't last. The Reich collapsed. And when the Soviet army swept through Poland in the winter of 1945, liberating concentration camps and uncovering the full scale of the Holocaust, the survivors began to tell their stories. Among them were several of the workers from Przemyśl, the ones who had made it through the labor camps, who had hidden in forests, who had been liberated from trains heading to Auschwitz. And they spoke about the Wehrmacht officer who had saved them. They didn't know much about him. Some remembered his name. Others only remembered his face, the uniform, the fake drunkenness, the moment when he had blockaded a bridge and opened the back of a truck. But they knew what he had done, and they wanted the world to know it too. Their testimonies were collected by Jewish organizations documenting acts of rescue during the Holocaust. The accounts were fragmentary. sometimes contradictory, but they all pointed to the same conclusion. Albert Battel had risked everything to save people he had no obligation to save. After the war, Battel returned to Germany, to a country that had been bombed into rubble and divided into occupation zones. He resumed his legal career, working quietly in the British sector, never speaking publicly about what he had done in Przemyśl. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't give interviews to journalists looking for stories of German heroism during the Nazi years. To him, what he had done wasn't heroism. It was the bare minimum of human decency, and the fact that it stood out as exceptional only highlighted how thoroughly the Third Reich had corrupted an entire society. He had saved 33 people. Millions had died. The math didn't add up to redemption. It added up to survival, to a choice made in a moment of clarity, to a gamble that had somehow worked. And for years, that's where the story ended. Albert Battel lived quietly, worked quietly, and tried to forget the sound of train whistles carrying people to their deaths. But the survivors didn't forget. In the years after the war, as Holocaust remembrance organizations began the difficult work of documenting rescuers, Battel's name kept appearing. Testimonies from Przemyśl, affidavits from workers who had scattered across the world after liberation, letters from families who had survived because one Wehrmacht officer had decided that orders could be bent, that regulations could be manipulated, that a well-timed performance of drunkenness could jam the gears of genocide just long enough to pull a few people out of the machine. And slowly, reluctantly, the world began to pay attention to the story of the Nazi officer who had faked being drunk to save lives. It was a story that didn't fit the clean narratives that people wanted to tell about the war. It was messy, morally complicated, and deeply uncomfortable. But it was true. The recognition came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the world wasn't quite sure what to do with a story that refused to be simple. In 1961, more than 15 years after the end of the war, survivors from Przemyśl formally submitted testimony to Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. They provided names, dates, details of the blockade, descriptions of the barracks where they had been hidden. They described how Battel had stumbled onto that bridge reeking of alcohol, how he had argued with SS officers while appearing barely coherent, how he had driven them to safety while the rest of the ghetto burned. The testimony was compelling, but it presented a problem for the committee tasked with evaluating it. Albert Battel had worn a Wehrmacht uniform. He had served the Third Reich. He had saluted the swastika and followed orders for years before that one moment of defiance. Could a man who had been part of the machinery of occupation truly be called righteous? Could someone who had enabled the system, even while sabotaging it from within, be honored as a rescuer? The debate within Yad Vashem was intense. Some argued that Battel's military service disqualified him from recognition, that honoring a Wehrmacht officer would send the wrong message about collective German guilt. Others pointed out that judging rescuers by their affiliations rather than their actions would exclude some of the most courageous acts of the entire war. After all, it was precisely because Battel had been inside the system that he had been able to manipulate it. A civilian couldn't have blockaded that bridge. A civilian couldn't have invoked military regulations to protect Jewish workers. The very uniform that made him complicit was also the tool he had used to save lives. It was a paradox that resisted easy moral categorization. And that's exactly what made the story so important, because the Holocaust wasn't a simple tale of pure evil versus pure good. It was a vast machinery of death that required the participation, or at least the passive acceptance of millions of ordinary people. And understanding how someone could exist within that system and still choose to resist, even once, was crucial to understanding how genocides happen and how they can be stopped. In 1963, Yad Vashem made its decision. Albert Battel would be recognized as righteous among the nations, the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. It was a controversial choice, one that generated debate in both Jewish and German communities. But the survivors had been clear in their testimony. Without Battel, they would have died. That fact couldn't be argued away or complicated into irrelevance. The medal was prepared, the certificate was drafted, and officials began the process of locating Albert Battel to inform him of the honor. But they were too late. Albert Battel had died in 1952, 11 years before the recognition was finalized. He had lived his final years in obscurity, never knowing that his actions would be remembered, never receiving any acknowledgement from the people he had saved or the society he had defied. He died believing that what he had done was a footnote, a small rebellion in a vast catastrophe, forgotten by history. The medal was awarded posthumously. A tree was planted in his honor at Yad Vashem, among the thousands of others representing rescuers from across Europe. But unlike many of the other honorees, there was no family to accept the recognition on his behalf. Battel's wife had died before him. He had no children. The few relatives who remained were distant, uncomfortable with the attention, uncertain how to reconcile the honor with the fact that he had still been a member of the Wehrmacht. So the recognition stood alone, a historical marker without a living connection, a testament to an act that had been buried under decades of silence and discomfort. And for years, that's where the story remained. A name on a list. A tree among trees. A footnote in the vast archive of Holocaust history. But footnotes have a way of resurfacing when the world needs them. In the decades that followed, as Holocaust denial began to spread, as revisionist historians tried to paint the Third Reich in softer colors, stories like Albert Battel's became weapons against erasure. Here was proof, documented and verified, that people within the Nazi system had known exactly what was happening, that they had understood the machinery of death they were serving, and that some of them, however few, had chosen to resist. Battel's story became evidence in trials, in documentaries, in educational programs designed to teach young people that complicity is a choice and that individual actions matter even in the face of overwhelming evil. The drunk Wehrmacht officer who had blockaded a bridge became a symbol, not of German redemption, but of the stubborn human capacity to choose conscience over conformity, even when the cost is everything. But the recognition at Yad Vashem was only part of the story, and in many ways it was the least important part. Because what mattered wasn't the medal or the tree or the historical footnote. What mattered was the moment itself, the actual event on that bridge in July of 1942, and the details of that moment, the specifics of how Albert Battel actually pulled off his deception, reveal something far more interesting than any posthumous honor ever could. This wasn't a spontaneous act of heroism. It wasn't a sudden crisis of conscience that made him act on impulse. It was a carefully planned operation that required Battel to understand the psychology of the SS, the bureaucracy of the Wehrmacht, and the specific vulnerabilities of the system he was trying to sabotage. He had been preparing for weeks, watching the movements of SS units, tracking the schedule of the action, identifying the exact moment when intervention would be possible without triggering immediate retaliation. And what he figured out was brilliant in its simplicity. The SS were terrified of paperwork battles with the Wehrmacht. The two organizations hated each other. The Wehrmacht viewed the SS as thugs and fanatics who undermined military discipline. The SS viewed the Wehrmacht as weak and insufficiently committed to National Socialist ideology. And that mutual contempt created bureaucratic friction that could be exploited by someone who understood how to weaponize regulations. Battel knew that if he confronted the SS with direct moral opposition, they would simply shoot him and move on. But if he confronted them with a bureaucratic obstacle, with the appearance of legitimate military authority backed by paperwork and regulations, they would hesitate. Not because they respected his authority, but because challenging him would require them to escalate through official channels, to file complaints, to justify their actions to Wehrmacht commanders who already resented SS interference. It would create delays, confusion, and the kind of administrative headache that even genocidal bureaucrats preferred to avoid. So Battel designed his intervention to look like a bureaucratic mistake rather than moral resistance. The alcohol was the key to the entire performance. By appearing drunk, Battel gave the SS officers an explanation for his behavior that didn't require them to suspect sabotage. He wasn't defying them. He was simply an incompetent drunk who had misunderstood his orders and accidentally created a blockade at exactly the wrong moment. And the beauty of that deception was that it gave the SS officers an easy way to save face. They could complain about him later, file reports about his incompetence, demand that he be disciplined or transferred. But in the moment, on that bridge, they couldn't simply shoot a Wehrmacht officer for being drunk on duty without creating a massive incident. So they argued with him. They demanded to see his orders. They threatened to report him to his superiors. And while they argued, while they radioed for clarification, while they tried to figure out how to navigate the bureaucratic mess Battel had created, he was loading people into the truck. The 33 workers he saved weren't randomly chosen. Battel had compiled the list in advance, identifying people who had skills that could be justified as essential to Wehrmacht operations. Mechanics, electricians, translators, clerks. People whose absence from the action could be explained as a legitimate military need rather than a humanitarian rescue. He had forged work orders for each of them, backdated to make it appear that they had been assigned to Wehrmacht projects weeks earlier. And when he presented these documents to the SS officers on the bridge, slurring his words and fumbling with the papers, he created the impression of a drunk officer who was technically correct, even if he was personally incompetent. The SS couldn't prove the documents were forged without launching a full investigation, and by the time such an investigation could be completed, the action would be over and the question would be moot. So they let him pass. Not because they believed him, not because they approved, but because stopping him would have been more trouble than it was worth in that specific moment. And that's what made Battel's plan so genius and so terrifying. He had understood that the Holocaust, for all its industrial efficiency and ideological fervor, still operated within a bureaucratic framework that could be jammed by someone who knew which gears to target. The SS weren't unstoppable monsters. They were government employees with paperwork and chain-of-command issues and institutional rivalries. And if you could exploit those vulnerabilities, if you could make resistance look like administrative confusion, you could create small pockets of survival within the machinery of death. It wouldn't save everyone. It wouldn't stop the genocide. But it could save 33 people on a specific day in a specific place. And for those 33 people, that was everything. That was the difference between existence and annihilation, between a future and a forgotten name on a list that no one would ever read. The immediate aftermath of the bridge incident was a masterclass in damage control. Battel knew that the moment he drove away from that blockade, the clock started ticking on his own survival. The SS officers he had humiliated would file reports. Questions would be asked. His commanding officers would demand explanations. And if he couldn't provide a bulletproof justification for his actions, everything would unravel. So he spent the next 72 hours building a fortress of paperwork around what he had done. He drafted requisition forms for the workers, retroactively creating a paper trail that suggested their assignment to Wehrmacht projects had been planned for weeks. He wrote memos to fictional supervisors confirming the essential nature of their skills. He even created maintenance logs, showing that these specific workers had been servicing Wehrmacht vehicles and equipment, making them too valuable to lose to an SS action. Every document was backdated, every signature was forged, every detail was designed to make his drunken intervention look like the sloppy execution of legitimate orders rather than deliberate sabotage. And it worked, at least initially, because the Wehrmacht officers above him didn't want to believe that one of their own had actively interfered with the final solution. Acknowledging that Battel had sabotaged an SS operation would have required them to take a stand, to either punish him or defend him, and neither option was appealing. Punishing him would mean admitting that the Wehrmacht was subordinate to the SS, that they had to enforce Himmler's racial policies even when it conflicted with military operations. Defending him would mean open conflict with an organization that had Heinrich Himmler's ear and Hitler's explicit support. So they chose the path of least resistance. They accepted Battel's paperwork at face value, filed it away, and hoped the problem would resolve itself. It was cowardice disguised as procedure, complicity wrapped in bureaucratic neutrality. But it bought Battel time, and time was the only currency that mattered when you were trying to keep people alive in the Third Reich. The SS, however, weren't willing to let it go so easily. They began their own investigation, interviewing witnesses, checking records, looking for inconsistencies in Battel's story. And they found them. The work orders didn't quite match up with other Wehrmacht documentation. Some of the signatures looked suspicious. The timeline of events was fuzzy in places. But here's where Battel's understanding of the system saved him again. The SS investigators were looking for evidence of Jewish sympathy or ideological weakness, and that's not what they found. What they found was evidence of incompetence, sloppiness, and possible minor fraud to cover up administrative mistakes. And that kind of low-level corruption was so common in the Wehrmacht that it barely registered as noteworthy. Officers routinely forged documents to secure resources, inflated the importance of their projects, and bent regulations to make themselves look more efficient. What Battel had done wasn't exceptional in that context. It was just business as usual in a military bureaucracy stretched beyond its capacity. So the SS filed a complaint, noted Battel as an unreliable officer, and moved on. They had bigger problems to deal with. The war on the Eastern Front was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. Partisan resistance was spreading across occupied Poland. And the Holocaust itself was entering a new, more frantic phase as the Nazi leadership realized that time was running out to complete their genocidal project. One Wehrmacht lawyer who had saved 33 Jews in a minor city wasn't worth the institutional battle it would require to prosecute him. The SS made a note in his file, ensured he would never be promoted or given significant responsibility again, and let the matter drop. For Battel, it was the closest thing to victory he could hope for. He had saved lives, maintained his cover, and survived the immediate consequences. But he also understood that he had used up whatever goodwill or bureaucratic protection he had. The next time he tried something like this, there would be no second chances. The workers in the barracks, meanwhile, existed in a state of constant anxiety. They understood that their protection was temporary, that it depended on Battel's continued presence and authority, and that both could evaporate at any moment. Some of them tried to establish connections with Polish resistance groups, preparing escape routes in case the Wehrmacht protection collapsed. Others focused on making themselves as useful as possible, working harder than required, volunteering for dangerous assignments, anything to prove their value. A few simply waited, too exhausted or traumatized to plan for a future that seemed impossible. They had watched their families, their neighbors, their entire community get loaded onto trains and sent to places whose names they whispered in horror: Bełżec, Sobibor, Treblinka. They were the lucky ones, the survivors of a random lottery determined by a Wehrmacht officer's conscience and a staged performance of drunkenness, and that knowledge was both a gift and a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. What none of them knew, what Battel himself couldn't have predicted, was that the system protecting them was already beginning to collapse. The Wehrmacht's authority in occupied territories was being systematically undermined as the SS consolidated power. The regulations Battel had exploited were being rewritten, the bureaucratic loopholes were being closed. And the German military leadership, sensing that the war was turning against them, was becoming less willing to antagonize the SS over relatively minor issues like the fate of a few dozen Jewish workers. The protection Battel had built was a sandcastle, and the tide was coming in. The only question was whether it would hold long enough for the workers to survive until liberation, or whether they would be swept away in the final desperate months of the Third Reich's death throes. And that answer wouldn't come from Battel's cleverness or courage. It would come from the movements of armies thousands of miles away, from decisions made in Moscow and Washington and London, from the vast machinery of a world war that had already consumed millions and showed no signs of stopping. By the time Albert Battel was transferred out of Przemyśl in the spring of 1943, the fragile system he had constructed was already showing cracks. The officers he had cultivated as reluctant allies proved unreliable the moment maintaining the protection became inconvenient. Some were transferred to other posts. Others simply stopped enforcing the regulations Battel had put in place, deciding that protecting Jewish workers wasn't worth the friction with the SS. And without Battel there to constantly reinforce the bureaucratic fiction, without his legal expertise to parry every challenge and create new justifications, the workers became vulnerable in ways they hadn't been before. The Wehrmacht command in Przemyśl began receiving pressure from SS administrators to release the workers for transfer to labor camps. Not extermination camps, the requests were careful to specify, but labor installations where their skills could be used for the war effort. It sounded reasonable, even logical, but everyone understood what labor camps meant: starvation rations, brutal conditions, and a life expectancy measured in months rather than years. One by one, the workers began to disappear from the barracks, first in small groups, then in larger transports. Some were sent to factories producing ammunition. Others went to construction projects building fortifications as the Red Army advanced from the east. A few were transferred to camps whose names would later become synonymous with horror: Płaszów, Majdanek, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Wehrmacht officers who signed the transfer orders told themselves they were following regulations, that they were simply complying with legitimate requests from other branches of the German administration. They didn't think of themselves as participating in murder. They were just processing paperwork, moving human resources from one column to another on a spreadsheet. And that willful blindness, that ability to reduce genocide to administrative tasks, was exactly what had made the Holocaust possible in the first place. Albert Battel had understood that. He had exploited that bureaucratic mentality to save lives. But he had also understood that it was a temporary exploit, a hack that would eventually be patched by a system designed to kill efficiently. By the end of 1943, fewer than a dozen of the original 33 workers remained in Wehrmacht custody in Przemyśl. The rest had been scattered across the vast network of camps and labor installations that stretched across occupied Poland and Germany. Some survived their transfers, many didn't. The exact number of deaths is unknown, because the Reich kept meticulous records of arrivals, but was far less careful about documenting who died from disease, starvation, or execution. What is known is that several of the workers Battel had saved from the July action ended up dying in camps months or years later, their brief reprieve ultimately meaningless in the face of a system designed to kill them. And that reality raises an uncomfortable question that haunted Battel for the rest of his life. If most of the people he saved ended up dying anyway, did his intervention actually matter? Was delaying death by 6 months or a year an act of heroism, or just a postponement of the inevitable? The survivors would later answer that question with absolute clarity. Yes, it mattered. Every additional day of life was a chance for the war to end, for the Allies to advance, for liberation to arrive before death did. Some of the workers who were transferred to labor camps in late 1943 survived until 1944, when the Soviet advance forced the Germans to evacuate camps and move prisoners westward. In the chaos of those evacuations, some escaped. Others were liberated by Soviet troops before they could be moved. A few ended up on death marches that killed thousands, but also created opportunities for escape that hadn't existed in the controlled environment of the camps. The additional months of life that Battel's intervention had bought them became the difference between dying in a gas chamber and surviving long enough to see liberation. For those individuals, the drunken Wehrmacht officer on a bridge in Przemyśl wasn't just a historical footnote. He was the reason they lived to have children, to tell their stories, to ensure that the Holocaust would be remembered by eyewitnesses rather than just historians. But Battel never knew which of the people he saved survived and which didn't. After his transfer, he lost all contact with Przemyśl and its survivors. He didn't know if his intervention had saved lives permanently or just delayed deaths temporarily. He spent the rest of the war in various administrative posts, his career effectively frozen by the SS's notation in his file. He was never promoted. He was never given command responsibility. He was kept in positions where his legal expertise was useful, but where he had no authority to interfere with SS operations. And when the war ended, when the full scale of the Holocaust became public knowledge, Battel didn't speak about what he had done. He didn't seek recognition or validation. He returned to civilian life, resumed his legal practice, and tried to process the fact that he had been part of a system that had murdered 6 million Jews while he had saved 33. The math was unbearable. The guilt was crushing. And the question of whether his actions had mattered at all became the central torment of his post-war existence. It wasn't until after his death, when survivors began providing testimony to organizations like Yad Vashem, that the full impact of his intervention became clear. Of the 33 workers he had saved from the July 1942 action in Przemyśl, at least 8 survived the war. 8 people who would have died on a specific day if Albert Battel hadn't blockaded a bridge while pretending to be drunk. 8 people who went on to have families, careers, lives that extended decades beyond the Holocaust. 8 people who represented dozens of children and grandchildren who existed because one Wehrmacht officer had decided that orders could be bent, and regulations could be manipulated, and bureaucracy could be weaponized against genocide. The number sounds small until you understand that in the mathematics of the Holocaust, where entire communities were erased and family lines were ended, 8 survivors represent a victory against erasure. They represent memory, testimony, and the stubborn refusal of humanity to be completely extinguished even in the darkest moments of history. The story of Albert Battel forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about heroism during the Holocaust. We want our heroes to be simple, morally uncomplicated figures who stood in pure opposition to evil. We want stories where the good guys wore one uniform and the bad guys wore another, where resistance was absolute and collaboration was unthinkable. But Battel doesn't fit that narrative. He wore a Wehrmacht uniform until the day Germany surrendered. He served the Third Reich for years. He followed orders, processed paperwork, and participated in the machinery of occupation. And yet, on one July morning in 1942, he also saved 33 lives by staging one of the most audacious acts of bureaucratic sabotage in the entire war. Those two realities coexist in the same person, and reconciling them requires us to accept that moral complexity doesn't erase moral action, that someone can be complicit in a system and still choose to resist it. That heroism during genocide often came from people who had already compromised themselves in ways that make modern audiences deeply uncomfortable. What makes Battel's story particularly important in today's world is how it illuminates the mechanics of resistance within authoritarian systems. He didn't have the luxury of grand gestures or public defiance. He couldn't march in the streets or publish manifestos or organize underground networks. What he had was knowledge of bureaucracy, access to paperwork, and the understanding that even totalitarian systems have vulnerabilities that can be exploited by insiders who know where to push. His weapon wasn't a gun or a bomb. It was a forged signature, a backdated document, and a performance of drunken incompetence convincing enough to create confusion in a system that depended on clarity and obedience. And that matters because most people living under oppressive regimes aren't in positions to launch armed rebellions or lead mass movements. What they have is access to small levers of power, bureaucratic processes they can subtly manipulate, moments where following the letter of the law can undermine its spirit. Battel's story is a blueprint for that kind of resistance, proof that individual actions within corrupt systems can save lives even when they can't topple the system itself. But his story also carries a warning. Battel's intervention saved a fraction of the people who needed saving. The vast majority of Przemyśl's Jewish population died in the Holocaust despite his efforts. And that disparity highlights a brutal reality. Individual acts of conscience, no matter how courageous, are not substitutes for systemic opposition to genocide. Battel could manipulate paperwork and create bureaucratic obstacles, but he couldn't stop the trains, couldn't close the camps, couldn't end the war. His heroism existed within strict limits imposed by his position and the power structures around him. And recognizing those limits is crucial, because it reminds us that while we should honor individual rescuers, we can't use their stories to absolve the millions of people who could have resisted but chose not to. For every Albert Battel, there were thousands of Wehrmacht officers who saw the same atrocities, had the same opportunities to intervene, and decided that their careers, their safety, and their comfort mattered more than the lives being destroyed around them. The fact that Battel's story was almost lost to history is itself significant. He died 11 years before receiving recognition from Yad Vashem. He never knew that survivors were searching for him, trying to honor him, wanting to thank the man who had given them a chance to live. His story survived only because a handful of people remembered his name and insisted on telling it to organizations that were documenting the Holocaust. How many other acts of resistance were lost because no one survived to tell them? How many people made similar choices, saved a few lives, and then disappeared into the anonymity of post-war Europe without recognition or acknowledgement? The historical record of the Holocaust is filled with gaps, with unnamed rescuers and forgotten acts of defiance, and Battel's near erasure from history reminds us that what we know about this period is only a effra, action of what actually happened. Today, more than 80 years after that bridge in Przemyśl, Battel's story resonates because we're living through a period where bureaucratic cruelty is once again being normalized, where systems of oppression hide behind paperwork and regulations, where ordinary people are being asked to process orders that dehumanize other human beings. And in that context, the story of a Wehrmacht officer who weaponized drunkenness and exploited bureaucracy to save lives becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a reminder that systems of oppression only function when people operate them, and that anyone with access to those systems has the power to jam the gears, even if only temporarily. Battel's methods can't be directly replicated because every authoritarian system has different vulnerabilities and different points of leverage. But the principle remains. If you understand how the machine works, you can sabotage it. And if you're willing to risk everything, you can save lives that the system has marked for destruction. The final lesson of Albert Battel's story isn't about what he did. It's about what he represents. The possibility of moral choice, even in the most morally compromised circumstances. He had every reason to do nothing. He had every excuse. He was just following orders, just doing his job, just one person in a massive system that couldn't be stopped by individual action. But he rejected those excuses and chose to act anyway, knowing that he might save a few dozen people at most, knowing that it wouldn't end the genocide or redeem his complicity, knowing that he might die for an intervention that history would never record. And he did it anyway. That choice, that refusal to accept the inevitability of atrocity, is why his story matters, because genocides don't happen all at once. They happen through a million small choices made by ordinary people who decide that going along is easier than resisting. And every time someone chooses to resist, even in small ways, even with limited tools, they prove that those choices exist and that claiming powerlessness is itself a choice. Albert Battel was a Wehrmacht officer, a servant of the Third Reich, and a man who saved 33 lives by pretending to be drunk on a bridge in occupied Poland. All of those things are true, and the uncomfortable coexistence of those truths is exactly why his story needs to be told, remembered, and understood by anyone who wants to believe that individual actions still matter in the face of overwhelming evil.